right, so last week what we did was we covered two main proofs for the existence of God. We'll call them arguments. I tried to couch giving these arguments within a greater sort of context of we're not really good at thinking. I mean, we reason, we rationalize in the world, but in terms of actually scientific thought, it takes a lot of training to become a scientist. It's not natural to a person to think in that way. And there's a lot of different biases that get in the way of properly thinking. Our different philosophy of science, different cognitive biases. So proofs are often a letdown. You're not going to run into people who are, living their life religiously based on a proof. They're nice. They develop a greater sophistication of knowing God and knowing ourselves, but they don't really do the trick in terms of convincing anybody that God's real. And number two, these proofs, even if on a technical ground, you can say, yep, these prove the existence of God, they do not necessarily prove the existence of the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So those are limitations, putting that on the table. So the first argument that we looked at was the teleological argument of design. And there we were kind of describing how that the universe is highly functional, highly interconnected, that it's clear that this thing has a designer. And it's more than just the metaphor of, the man wandering in a field and discovering a watch, saying, well, of course, this had a maker. That the design argument is a proportional argument. It's like everything looks like it was designed. It's not just some random watch. Everything looks that way. It really meets a challenge that a lot of atheists have and it's a fair argument, this argument of the God of the gaps. That within human history, the more that we learn about science, the less we have to use the explanation, because God willed it. Why does the sun rise? Well, it used to be because God willed it. Now we know, well, there's mechanics behind it. Well, the design argument is actually, that's really great, because the more that we can find the universe looking like it was designed and functioning, well, the better we are by saying there must be a God. So we're able to escape the God of the gaps. Not only that, but the complexity of this design is such that we actually are able to see it. It's not just, there's a design, it's not just things have a function, but that we are actually able to engage our world and notice it has meaning, notice that it has purpose, and we're able to use that world. So it goes both ways. So that was the teleological argument. The next argument we covered was the cosmological argument. This was the cause and effect hypothesis, that there's a first cause, and that the farther back you go in time, well, at a certain point, you're going to have to hit the first cause, the first mover. That it's fair to say that time is limited, that there's no infinite amount of time to play around with, so we're eventually going to hit something that's going to look like a creator. What we can take out of this argument is whatever that creator is going to be, whatever that first cause is going to be, can't look like our world. This creator has to stand out of time. This force, this cause, can't look like anything within the world. It can't be a created concept. So that actually fits very nicely in how the Rambam is defining God in his first three principles of faith. So that's what we got out of that principle, out of this argument. So by taking on these proofs, we can kind of almost like work backwards and say, okay, great, now that we have these arguments, what must be the thing that made a designed world or a world based on cause and effect? And we boils down to four different traits. The world has order. So the creator must have some level of intelligence. He wanted to create, so this creator must have the ability to choose. That the world itself, if we take a look at human history, the thing that we like talking about most is moral behavior. That's in every movie, every play, every philosophy book. Every story is about how to interact with people in a proper way. So this creator must care about moral behavior. And that these moral behaviors, these rules of life, they seem to function pretty consistently. and are within the creation itself. So that's what we came out with. If we want to reject these proofs, we're going to have to do some dancing. If we reject the design argument or the cosmological argument, well, we're going to have to be willing to argue, well, maybe there really isn't design. Maybe it's a mistake that we see the world as having design, and really everything is hefker. Or maybe in this galaxy there's something called physics, but who says in other galaxies? There are rules of physics and there's rules of chemistry and things like that. That's a stretch. That's a hard argument to have. The other thing we'd have to accept if we're going to reject these arguments is we're going to have to grapple with the infinite regress problem. It's kind of like the way I kind of put it last week was, well, great. If there's an infinite amount of time and we exist here, well, what that means is there's an infinite amount of moments that we have to pass through to get to this point. Well, if there's an infinite amount of time we got to get past to get to this moment in time, we can never actually arrive at this moment in time. It's a paradox. It's a paradox you can't overcome. In order to arrive at this specific moment in time, there has to be a limited amount of time. And the last two problems would be something along the lines of we'd have to take on an idea of the theory of multiple universes, that in order to get around the statistics, that sure there's design, but it's all a fluke, some crazy statistical anomaly, we'd have to say there's an infinite amount of universes, and lucky us, we're in the right universe where everything makes sense. And the last problem is the problem of consciousness. I mean, that one, just no one has an answer to. How did it turn out that rocks figured out how to be aware of themselves? How do you work that problem out?
I didn't know rocks were aware.
They're not. That's the point, but we are. If we're going to take on an evolutionary-based way of describing the world, and fair enough, you can do that, that's one major problem. How did rocks develop consciousness in the form of people? So that's a problem that these two arguments can tackle, but if we reject them, we're left with some big problems. Okay. So that's where we got to last week. Like I said, this doesn't do the trick. This doesn't prove the existence of the God that we all know and love, of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But an argument from experience does. There's three basic parts to this. If you look in Rav Sadia Gaon's Emunos Videos, he kind of gets into this sort of argument, an argument from human experience. Or the Kuzari, he also gets in this argument. There's basically three different ways to break this one up. An argument of pragmatism, like religion works, it actually does something. Looking at history. And the last is our own personal experiences, our own individual meaning that we have in our lives. And if we're able to size those three up, we can have a fair argument for the existence of God that actually speaks to our bodies, it actually speaks to our heart, and not just our brains. That was the downside of the other two arguments. They just can't measure up when it comes to talking about our bodies and our hearts. So what's pragmatism? What does it mean, this first part, about religion actually does something? If you read the works of the new, they're called the New Atheists, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. You heard of these guys? Mm-hmm. Smart guys. The way that Richard Dawkins kind of describes religion, he says that it's like a evolutionary byproduct. It's a parasite. It's a leftover from other evolutionary processes. And it's a drain on resources. It's irrational. It costs loads of money. There's no rational reason whatsoever to have it. It's a parasite. That's his basic argument. And his book, The God Delusion, more or less is pushing that trip the whole, I think, the 300 odd pages. That's the outcome of that book. Unfortunately, he didn't talk to moral psychologists. If he would have had a nice conversation with Jonathan Haidt, he would have had a lot to say to counter, because it just simply isn't true. Religion does two very specific things. It stabilizes a person's life on an individual level, And it also creates the ability to trust other people.
Can you explain how?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Okay, great.
That's exactly what I'm going to do. As far as stability goes, religion's a map of meaning. Halacha is a map of meaning. And when we're confronted in life with, whether it be, authoritarian, rules that don't make sense, oppressive people in your life, well, you're gonna feel fear. When you want to fit into the group, because maybe you're a little bit of an outsider with your beliefs, you're gonna feel fear. When people are going to tell you that you're not just letting them down, you're going to feel fear. Fear basically is stepping into the unknown. It's where everything is not going to make sense. It's not worked out. So what religion does, in a general sense, what halacha does in a general sense, is it actually outlines in exquisite detail meaning and purpose, goal to shoot for, something to live up to, the known world. And so when life throws that sort of garbage at you, and you feel fear, you're going to more or less have one foot in the known world. And what fear does, fear is a tough one, just on a biological level. What basically happens is your prefrontal cortex, the thing that enables you to actually think, shuts down. The blood literally drains out from that part of your brain and goes into your arms and legs, getting you ready to fight. Thinking is not clear. So it would do a lot of good to be able to have one foot in the known world, to be able to have one foot that is able to stabilize you in those situations, that actually enables you to make real choices. Because as soon as you start getting in fights with people, as soon as people start pushing you around, most of it's just going to be instinct. Most of it's just going to be habit. And there are few people that have had the time in their lives to be able to habituate themselves in such a way where they can stand up under that pressure. A famous example was a researcher, his name was Milgram. It was right after World War II. That everyone after World War II was trying to figure out, how could it be an entire country decided to become genocidal? That was the big sociological question on everybody's plate. And so what Milgram did was the way he kind of set up this experiment, he was testing out how does authority work, more or less. That was his question. Is there really such a thing as I was just following orders? So he would bring people in off the street, and say, listen, we need, we're running an experiment, and it's an experiment on memory. Now there's someone else in another room, and they were supposed to memorize a list. And what your job is going to be is they're going to read this list off to you. And every time that they get something wrong, they don't remember correctly what they were supposed to memorize, well, you get to give them an electric shock. Bzz.
Awesome.
Right. Now, the way it was designed, this dial, it was, and they played around, they redid this experiment over and over, and they're playing around with, how obvious does the man in the white coat have to be, letting this guy know that the more that he electrocutes the guy on the other side is going to die. It was like on the dial they'd have like skull and crossbone, or 0 to 100, red zone danger. They even listed this will kill. This is deadly. That was another version. This will kill. And sure enough, most people had a high likelihood of getting to the point where they were killing the person on the other side. Now, it was a joke. There was no guy on the other side, and it was an actor, and his job was to scream, every time he got shocked. And, he could be heard in the other room. But one interesting thing, so it came out that...
It was all a lie?
It was all a lie. Well, most sociological experiments, there's a lie hiding, because they're statistic researchers.
So, why
That's actually
the
wonderful.
guy Who was being tested? The guy who was shocking the guy?
Yep.
I don't get it.
To see, will he listen to authority? Will he actually kill somebody just because he's wearing a lab coat?
No.
Yeah.
Did anyone do it though?
Yeah, but a lot of people did.
Went to the extent where they were going to kill them?
Yeah.
It was awful.
I think it was pretty bad.
So
Yeah.
what was the point of this? That you shouldn't follow authority?
The point was to show that it's human nature that when we feel under pressure, we stop analyzing what we're doing. When we feel a bit of fear, when an authority tells us what to do, well, we don't want to let them down. We don't want to. I mean, after all, he went to university. He's the doctor. I mean, they know best.
It's
like
he just had a lab coat on.
Yeah.
Anything with his background.
Yeah.
They would only say.
The guy saying, "Go ahead and give the shock."
Yeah. And the entire time, there's no conversation between them. The man just said, "Administer the shock."
Oh, it was horrible.
Or,
I mean, some of these
further.
versions, they had the guy on the other side pleading for his life.
Yeah, and he'd be like,
it's like I have a heart. I have a heart condition. They played around with it. They had a good time.
This was so cruel to me.
Yeah.
But
Yes, it
just
was.
because someone in a lab coat told him to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a follow-up, so it's fine.
There was bunches.
Yeah, but they could have psychologically damaged this
Oh, they
person.
did. They did, and that's actually why what came out of this was they started to make ethical rules on how you do research because people were emotionally damaged.
I mean,
Did they
like,
pay for the therapy?
I have no idea.
you got paid to, you get paid to be involved in these experiments.
Well, that probably wouldn't cover the therapy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's what people do. Sometimes they go down to universities and just get paid.
I think.
Yeah, well, it's something like that. So what they found in this research was in terms of the likelihood of someone religious going through and killing somebody was significantly less. They still did it. It's not a magic bullet, but this was one of the first of many research projects that came out that people.
I don't think I'd do it.
Yeah, that's what everyone says.
I think I'd stop shocking them. I'm not really good with authority, so I would ignore it.
Very good. There you go. You're an outlier. So what came out of this and different research projects along the way was what religion actually does in many ways is that it enables people to have greater love for people in your group that you associate with. But the other cool thing was it actually reduces the likelihood you'll hate people outside of your group. Now what's neat about that is it doesn't make you love people outside your group. You actually have to make a choice if you're going to let them in your life or not. It sets you up to make that choice. But that's one big thing religious does. It stabilizes you. Another way of looking at this, in my line of work, people coming in with complex PTSD or
What do you do?
I'm a therapist. I do this as a hobby.
Really?
Really. So what PTSD is basically is someone who, generally speaking, is people with lower IQs, and people have have a very, very black and white way of looking at the world. There is good and there is bad. And when they're confronted by pure evil, and man is there pure evil in this world, they don't know what to do with it. And the worst of all, it's usually when they did the thing that's questionable. So that's why a lot of times people coming back from say Afghanistan or Iraq, they killed people. And man, is that something you don't want to do.
That's what I want to do. No, not the killing people, but work with people with PTSD.
Really? Okay, there you go.
I want to do what you do.
You like getting a rise out of people. I'm also good. That was
Really
good. That was a double entendre. I liked that. That was good.
No, but I meant to do I want to be a therapist.
I got you. So their basic problem is that their map of meaning is so vague. And so, if you only two options you have in life is good and bad, there's a lot of room to think that you're horrible. There's a lot of room to live in the world of fear. Life is more complex than that. And what halacha does, because of its crazy detail, one message is for sure you're going to take out of it, is life is anything but simple. You never can have something which is black and white. You look at our religion is, everything is a debate. Everything is under discussion. Well, there's a reason why, because life ain't simple. But by having that card in your back pocket, you're able to confront these sorts of things in your life. And you're able to make choices you need to make and make them responsible in a responsible way because you're less likely to live in a world of fear. The more you know, the more calm you're going to be. It's as straight as that. So religion is a stabilizing force. As far as trust goes, Look, the research is just like nutty. Simply believing that you have free will. I'm not even in the question of can we prove there's free will or not. I don't really care. There's free will, whatever. But as a research question, those people who believe there's such a thing as free will, they're more stable individuals. They are better able to develop relationships. They're more easily able to have more long-term relationships, less likely to get divorced. They actually are able to trust people. Because a part of it's kind of like it's kind of a stabilizer, but it's in a sense of if you feel that if you believe you have free will, well, you have a lot of agency, you have a lot of power in life. You're not a victim. There's a lot to be said for not being a victim. When you're not a victim, you're able to trust other people. You're able to care about other people. They just go hand in hand. It binds people together. Within the Jewish diamond business, it's a good example. You get into the diamond industry, like, man, is there such overhead because you're worried about the other guy screwing you. I mean, you're dealing in hype merchandise. There's a lot to lose, and a lot to lose very quickly. And so most of the money that you're investing in the diamond business is security, simple as that. But in the diamond district amongst the Jews, like, the overhead is almost nothing because we trust each other. Jews don't think other Jews are going to do them. And they don't have to pay for it. And they make more profit because of it. They know who they're dealing with. They're dealing with someone who also realizes there's someone watching them. So that's one aspect of this. Rates of giving charity are much higher in religious communities, not just within the religion itself, but I think Jews are the number one donor to the Red Cross.
Aren't they super anti-Semitic?
They pale in comparison. Oh, there's a lot the Red Cross does, and a lot the Red Cross should have done. But that's more of a individual screwing up as opposed to an organization. They do a lot of good. They've saved some lives. Didn't do such a great job in Rwanda, I'll tell you that. But they donate a lot of money to these organizations because they trust that they can make a difference in the world. Like I said, better marriages, less likely to suffer from anxiety and depression and other personality disorders, just because you're living a religious life. With everything in life, there's always three components. There's the genetic component. There's nurture, where you grew up, but there's also the life story you tell yourself. You can never escape any of those three. So it's like religion does a good job at helping develop a life narrative. It does a pretty good job of creating a natural environment that can enable people to learn how to trust and cash in on it. Because people are not bad, generally speaking. You have to do a lot to screw people up, to screw societies up, where people get seriously hurt. You have to work at it. But, say, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that today, but save that, people are actually decent people. I was reading a story about this guy. He was in DC, hated his job. He was an accountant. And, what he started doing was he started selling candies in this, in the lobby, where he worked. He was making a fair amount of money. And he realized, well, all he had to do was have a cup out. People always paid. It was rare for anybody to just take without paying. So what he ended up doing is he quit his job, distributed donuts, candies all over the DC area in every office, just with a little cup. Based on trust alone, he was able to quit his dead-end job that he hated. He was making a killing.
It worked?
Of course it worked, because people are, generally speaking, people are worthy of people are worthy of trust. But if you don't have a system that teaches you that, well, how are you ever going to learn it? Religion does that. So what comes out from a sociological perspective is, man, did Richard Dawkins get it wrong? It's you from a financial perspective, it pays off to be religious because you learn how to trust people. You learn how to be in relationships with people. Academics alone. This is just funny. If you're going to be religious, guess what? You're more likely to graduate high school, more likely to graduate university, more likely to be making more than $50,000 a year. That's great. Like that's something that's money in the bank quite literally, because it's a stabilizing force and enables people to trust one another. That's what religion gives the world.
Even other religions, was that not your religion?
This is general.
At the same time, though, when a religion gets too extreme, it starts to drive people away.
Yep.
And those people
That can happen.
are so much less likely to trust people of their own religion.
Yep, that can happen. 100%. But they're rare. Those are rare cases.
I'm trying to think of what you said and compare it to my community, and I'm
Yeah.
just having trouble.
Okay. Well, listen. We're people. We're threat sensitive. Where it's always easier to see the negative. It's like if you lose $5, it feels 3 times as worse as if you find $5. That's just the way we're built. It's a survival skill. If you're always, it pays off to be a little freaked out and a little suspicious because you're less likely to die. But that doesn't mean it's true.
What about in Israel?
It doesn't mean it's true.
Is it like that in
Israel's a very good example.
But it's so dangerous, isn't it?
I'm just likely to die.
Like people get killed all the time.
Not true.
What? Sleep.
I mean, if you look at a broader context, you ask the question: is the world getting better or worse? Like most people say, it's getting worse. But when you actually crunch the numbers, there's less mortality, less disease, less war, less murder, less crime across the board. And
Isn't Israel
always,
at war?
I'm gonna kill you though. You know.
No, we were nearly,
I
but
told
we're
you
not
earlier,
anymore.
but you were like, no.
There's
I'll
really?
touch my video.
No.
now I want to kind of
Video.
I want to touch a little bit about well, if religion can do that, that's great.
Can create trust.
Can people do it on their own? Well, we ran that social experiment. That was called communism.
But doesn't that
It's funny. I mean, you think about like all the thought. I mean, Marx was not a moron. Karl Marx was a fairly smart
Technically,
guy.
communism should
The
work.
basis
In
behind
reality,
it
it
is very
can.
intriguing.
It's
but
like-
In theory, it should work. In theory, it
it's
should
like-
work.
No,
But
the
people
issue
are
is on
small
small
scale.
scale.
Exactly.
It does.
That's
On small-
exactly.
yeah, small
In
scale,
theory,
yeah.
it should work because theory we should get all equals, but we're not equal.
It doesn't work that way.
Exactly.
I mean,
Small
yes,
scale it does, but once it becomes evident that you're not equal to this person, or they're not equal to this person, or whatever, or however you're doing, or at the same time, once bigger things become at stake, greed becomes a factor, and humility becomes a factor.
Yeah.
Read any sci-fi book. It's always what it's about. About how
Yeah, that
they
message.
try to do an equal world and
It doesn't do it.
erupts into
doesn't.
corruption.
It doesn't do it. Adopt
Like
one.
Divergent.
Adopt a single value. It sounds good. Like who can argue with fair?
Yeah.
But fair buried 100 million people. That's what fair did.
It wasn't actually.
100 million people died because of the idea of fair. That's something to think
Say that
about.
word.
It's something to think about. You should give Richard Dawkins some pause. That's my pushback on him.
But at the same time, in that idea, like when you do try to have that, like just in society, it ends up becoming some form of like sad religion to the point of like whether it's like a weird cult or whatever, or communism, which is honestly kind of cult-like. Let's be real, like it does end up becoming that.
Yeah, that's what they become.
Mockery.
That's what they become. Even though a lot of really good ideas and a lot of good papers and a lot of good books on it, trying to develop the idea, and it intuitively is like, hey, yeah, fair. Why not do that? But it just doesn't work.
People suck.
The next part of this, yeah.
Sorry.
The next part of this, it was history of the Jewish people. Now we're getting a little more personal. That was more religion as a general experience. Judaism's weird. It's easy to take for granted that, out of every ancient civilization that has ever been, we're the only ones still hanging around. And we defy survival. Survival and the Jewish people are buddies. There's something about a religion that enables a lot of stability, enables a lot of trust, so that, we're kind of the last man standing when it comes to the world's history. Especially given the fact the world has been consistently trying to do a fair job of killing us off. It's not just that we're being left to nature here. We faced a lot of people who really wanted to develop some really exquisite plans to knock us off. It doesn't work out so well. That's number one. In many ways, I think like Judaism and history are the same thing. So when you kind of look at major criticism people have of a religious life is people investing too much time in old nonsensical antiquated debates that happened 2,000 years ago. It's like getting the real world is usually the criticism people have against Judaism. Why do we care so much about old debates? It's because they were really good debates. You can think of in many ways they're kind of like archetypes. An archetype is, you have in stories, take stories are a great example. The archetypal hero, or the archetypal villain. It's like those sort of things are like condensed truth to the point where there's nothing more truthful than a good hero, because a good hero is basically every hero that's ever lived, that's ever, walked the face of the earth, and it's kind of been condensed in this one figure. That's truth. And the debates that occurred in the Gemara that were written down, that are being carried through history, they're not just, interesting ideas, but they're the most truthful things to think about that are very applicable in our daily life. They're concentrated truth in that very, very same way. Taking more of a psychological way of looking at it, Carl Jung did a lot to develop this idea of the collective unconscious. What is the historical memory of a group of people. He got into a lot of trouble. It was around the time when the Nazis were taking over Germany that he wrote a paper more or less describing that. It was a funny thing to say. He looked at the unconscious as like an infinite well of possibility that a person can dip into and grow into becoming a better person. And the way he looked at it is that, people are, by definition, the community they belong to. You can't escape that. So he looked at the Jewish people as almost like that's the best it can be. That's what he wrote. It's like the Jewish people are the most mature culture that ever existed. It's like, it wasn't that he was trying to say, that there's no more room for growth, but it was like everything is actualized when you look at the Jewish people. They've gone the deepest of any culture, and they've come out with the most meaning. That's what Carl Jung had to say. And he got in trouble for saying it. He was kind of comparing the Jewish people to the German culture, as that being like a more youthful, more like, baby type of culture that had a lot of room to grow. That was the way he was kind of framing it. So I think people kind of took it wrong as, like Jews can't grow anymore, like the culture's dead. He's like, that's not the point. It's like, we took the thing that, meaning is hard to articulate, and the Jewish people were able to do it. That's something to be proud of. But that only comes out of the Gemara. That only comes out of the halachic discussions that have been going on for thousands of years. The more serious you take life, the more detail you're willing to take into account, the more mature you're just going to be. It's as simple as that. And that was his point that he was making.
It seems like he's comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
he's talking about Jewish culture, but then he talks about German culture, but German isn't a religion. If he would have said Israeli culture versus German culture, that's apple to apple. That kind of doesn't make any sense. Did he specifically go for a certain group of German people who were like of a certain like area? It's difficult because Judaism isn't only a religion. It is like it's a society at the same time. Because
it just seems like
we're not just a religion though. It's more than just a religion. It's like a group of people living together. So like where you do have those communities, like it's not just that.
Yeah, he was kind of looking at religious, not religious. The whole group, which that says a lot. It's like the non-religious Jews have gained like insanely from the religious aspect of Judaism. They get to ride on the coattails of what religious Jewish life has produced. I mean, you see that, again, I was kind of mentioning about all the fun facts of, if you're religious, you get all these positives in your life. Well, the research bears out that after 3 generations of Jews not being religious, they lose that. They look like the general population. So it's like, Our IQ goes down. And this is a fun one. Jews have a higher IQ than the rest of the world's population by 1 standard deviation. That's a lot. It's like you lose your IQ, you lose your willingness to have mercy on people, and you give less tzedakah, and you have the same rates of anxiety and depression like everyone else. You lose that after 3 generations. So it's hard to make that delineation between religious Jews and not religious Jews. Like it's a culture, I mean, kind of the way you were saying it. But that's what he was tackling. He was tackling the whole idea of the thing. Another angle on this whole history of the Jews is the fact that this one maybe you'll give me problems over because gosh man, this one gets too tedious. But the idea of national revelation, that what makes Judaism unique as a religion is that we're the only religion that has had national revelation. So you can look up Kellerman, you can look up Gottlieb. I mean, they got loads of stuff to talk about it. And the reason why I say this one gets pretty hairy is because as soon as you look it up, you start seeing everyone hates it. Everyone's against the argument. Everybody is coming up with example after example of other cultures that had national revelation. So it literally becomes a full-time job disproving these things. So I took about a year, I was playing around with this, trying to find, as a challenge to myself, find, is there a genuine example where it can go from beginning to end to be a legitimate national revelation? I wasn't able to come up with one. If you guys find one, send it my way. But they're always presented in these, you get on Reddit or, on the line, all these, little, scroll down the page and you find one more, vulgar idea after another. It's like, it becomes a full-time job defending the idea. So, okay, maybe you guys can push back, but it's a fair thing to at least think about. I think mostly what's most valuable with that way of, that sort of argument, I guess, isn't so much the idea that, Judaism can't be a victim of conspiracy. And it's like, okay, well, maybe it could, and maybe it could. But conspiracies really, they mean something when you're trying to convince other people about what you believe. Judaism is really not into that. If you're not Jewish, who says you need to be Jewish? We don't missionize. So we really do have our national experience, and that's that. It's not something that necessarily ever needed to be proven. I think that's probably the best way of looking at that argument, is it was never an argument to begin with. It was more like a description of a common history. As an argument, you could say, yeah, maybe you're trying to convince somebody. If you're really, as an argument, maybe you're really trying to, get people to join the club. But Judaism was never about joining the club.
We discourage people from it.
We discourage people from it, 100%. I'm saying whether you like that sort of argument or not, it's worth looking at it from that lens that it's something different when you're not trying to convince people of it. It's more like just sharing your day. It's kind of a funny way of thinking about it. I woke up, brushed my teeth, went to school. That's kind of how the Jewish people look at national revelation. One day we woke up, Moshe came along, and there was the Torah right there. It's not an argument to be taken. So it's almost like the innocence of it gives it its strength. Something like that. The other oddity with Judaism as a religion is the fact that, we're the only religion that is trying to make rabbis obsolete. Everyone's encouraged to learn. We take that for granted nowadays because, from a secular standpoint, of course you're supposed to learn. That's how you get a job. And even there, we can kind of nitpick a little bit that, from a secular standpoint, it's not so much you're learning to learn things, but it's more so you can be an effective factory worker. It's actually a problem within modern day education. They haven't actually caught up to educating people to live in the 21st century. It's mostly in all of the, first, second, third, fourth grade, the most important thing you learn is follow directions. Why is following directions so important? So you can work in a factory and you can follow directions because you need to know how to follow directions to work a machine. It's only recently we're confronting this problem of, wait a second, we actually have to educate people to think. Take the coal industry as a prime example. Or, truckers. These people, they're losing their jobs. They're going out of business. And they went to high school. They graduated. And it's going to be worth spit because we're now living in an age where following directions is not going to get you anything. You have to be able to create. Well, Judaism has always advocated creation. We don't just give axioms of belief. This is the halacha and there's no debate. What do you mean there's no debate? There's always debate. There's always trying to be creative, always trying to discover something new, trying to know more than what can be known. And that's the Jewish education. That's what we get out of it. And so it's like, well, when you're telling everybody that message, you're basically challenging them to be smarter than the rabbi. That's what we want out of people, to take command of their lives and be able to make their own decisions, standing on their own 2 feet in a responsible way. You look at the history of religion, man, no other religion was really into that. With Christianity up until the Protestant Reformation, they used to chain Bibles to the podium where the priest would stand to give his sermon. It was like symbolic, like don't dare touch this. Reading is dangerous. All the first printing presses were run by the Jews. It was like, reading's great, learn more, fantastic idea. It took a long time for the non-Jews, even though a non-Jew created the printing press. It took a long time for the rest of the group to catch up. Islam also. One reason why Islam fell behind from a educational standpoint is because they valued beauty over knowledge. It's like wisdom has to be beautiful, so it has to be handwritten in calligraphy with the pictures and this and that. Well, that cost them 400 years of educational development. We Jews were like, we don't care, looks like garbage, just fine with us, as long as it has something worthwhile on the page to read. That's unique. You don't find that anywhere else. So it's worth taking note. The personal experience is the last component of this. And I want you guys to think about this one. Because what Judaism is trying to do, basically, is trying to answer, how are things meaningful? But in the same time, it's presenting a problem. Because it never actually gives, it might tell you the end, the conclusion of the problem. It's almost like a math book. In the math books, they always had the odd problems in the back, so you could kind of check your work. But it never actually described how did you arrive at the solution. So it's like you're fighting with all the odd numbers, trying to figure out, geez Louise, you're for sure only getting 50% of this work correct because you're just copying the answers in the back of the book, but it doesn't actually give you how did you arrive at the problem. Well, Judaism is exactly like that. It's giving you all the answers. But what's on you guys is to figure out how did you arrive at those answers? How do you live the process at arriving at those answers? But you have to be playing the game to arrive at those answers. So it's like the question: Can you prove to me Judaism is a real religion? Is that is there? It's not just is there really a God, but is there really a God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? You got to be willing to play the game to find out that answer. And if you're not willing to play the game, you will never have that answer. Period. So it's like nothing can ever be said to you to convince you Judaism is real except your own lived experience. And that's a choice everyone has to make. Are you going to give it a test drive or not? But you have to have a license to drive. No one just gets behind the wheel of a car. You really have to know who you are. I can't give you a solution to that in 9 minutes. And I wish I could. So maybe next week we'll kind of develop this idea of tactics to try and figure that one out, how to better understand who you are, have some strategy behind that. I think one idea I think that no one takes seriously and everyone needs to take seriously is as people we are both good and evil. There is a line running down the human heart that separates good and evil, and that line runs down to the depths of hell. And if we don't take that seriously, and if we don't figure out who we are, if we don't take responsibility for the fact we can be monsters and angels simultaneously, we're never going to get a license. We're never going to be able to drive. We'll never seriously know who we are. And man, that question gets complex because it's never obvious if someone is actually being a monster. You know, one of the most easy ways to be a hidden monster is the self-righteous coward. It's the person who for moral reasons, I didn't want to get involved. They seemed to be fighting pretty hard. What could I do? Maybe it's really just best for me to stay out of it, not to help out someone who's confused. It's almost like people who are taking these positions that they sound reasonable. They sound like, okay, fair enough. It's true that, sometimes it isn't a good idea to step in between a conflict between two other people. But you have to check yourself because maybe you're just being a coward. Maybe you really could help somebody out. Maybe it's because you're really not so interested in other people's development. And it's easier not to look that way. And there's the other end, people who look too good. And I don't mean like popularity contests. I'm talking about moms and dads that don't let their kids grow up. It's like constantly being afraid of letting people get hurt in life. What ends up happening is you just fragilize people. People never end up learning that they actually are strong. That's a problem that's definitely at the forefront today in the world of psychology. And it looks great. I mean, who could argue? Why should I let my kid out on his own? Maybe someone will hurt him. I mean, it's a great theory. It sounds reasonable. But brass tacks, most people don't get kidnapped. Most people don't get hurt. It happens. Not usually. I think it's something like, 100 people in the United States every year are actually kidnapped by a stranger. That's how many kids are kidnapped each year. More people fall out of bed and die than get kidnapped. It's like, that's not dangerous. Maybe the world's not as bad as you think. Maybe you can let your kids get a couple broken arms and broken legs, and they'll learn it's okay, and they're stronger than what they really think they are. That looks really good, but man, is it not. And they've been tracking it. I mean, since 2004, this problem is getting worse and worse. I kind of put it to you guys, when was the last, in my generation, the earliest I could go out unaccompanied by an adult was 6 years old. What is it with you guys? When did you go out? Maybe you're more of a rebel. You'll tell me 4, but
Since I got to Israel.
Right. Since you got to Israel.
I was up by myself
What is it?
at 7.
When was the first time you went out unaccompanied without an adult?
I'm trying to remember. Well, I grew up
Yeah.
in my block.
Yeah.
I did grow up in the city, but the block I lived on was kind of a suburb block. So
Yeah,
when
okay.
I was 4, I'd go outside, but
Yeah, it was-
everyone, we'd
Yeah,
play in the
yeah, yeah.
street.
You play in the street, yeah. That's
Anyone who
normal.
turned on
There you go.
to Farwell knew to look for kids.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I wasn't alone. I mean,
You wasn't alone, right? And that's the thing. Like, you go down any Israeli street, like, this problem has not hit Israel, not by a long shot. Like, it's like it's infested with children. I mean,
saw a
they're all
6-year-old
over
on
the
the
place.
bus
Yeah,
with
that's
a baby.
sure.
I worry
it was a
about
6-year-old pushing a stroller with
Yeah.
a newborn in it.
Sure, mom was. If it was a baby, mom's probably in the back. But yeah,
A
I mean,
newborn, like a 1-year-old.
Six
There was no
six-year-old are taking the bus, and they are just fine.
Would you let your kid do that?
I do let my kid do that.
How many kids do you have?
I got 4 kids.
And how young was
Ezra?
what's the youngest you let them out?
Goes out with Bina. She's 11. I'll let him go out with Bina. They're fine.
That's insane.
11-year-old, but how old was she when she first went on the bus?
7, 8. And I was fighting earlier. My wife wasn't so comfortable. That was a family fight in the Bender household. She'll be just fine,
Where's
honey.
your wife from?
Yeah, she's from Manhattan.
That's why. No way, Manhattan. You gotta be.
Yeah, I don't know.
No.
So it's like it's not so clear. It's like not so clear. Like, sometimes you look really good, and man, are you being a terror? And it's like you gotta know. And you only know that if you know yourself.
It's like walking all around.
You only know that if you know
You think it
yourself.
was, but no, I didn't go a lot alone until I was like 14.
Yeah.
My dad was very.
Yeah.
My mom died when I was young, so my dad was very overprotective of us.
And it's more than that, because I'm really selling this hard. It's like I'm using really big words like terror, but that's fine. Like, you can be bad. I mean, it's kind of like a funny way of putting it. Like, there's only bad with being bad, but like, that's a normal part of being a human being. Like,
So
that's
we're allowed
okay.
to be bad.
Just as long as you sort it out, that's all. It's like everyone fails and everyone succeeds. There's lots of things that we do that are good, and there's lots of things that we do are bad. But the mistake that everyone makes is they get hung up on the bad. They're unwilling to face it. They get avoidant over it, and they form a complex. It's like, all I am is good. It's like, man, if all you are is good, like, you're probably not fun to hang out with, number one. And number two, you probably ain't growing so much. It's like, it's okay to be bad. But it's okay to be bad in as far as recognizing so you can do something about it.
So like it's like the thing, every mistake can be corrected.
Yeah. Every mistake can be corrected. Yeah.
What was that?
Yeah. On some level, every mistake can be corrected.
But what about like the unforgivable things?
Yeah,
I
is
bet
there
you're
such
a fun
thing?
therapist.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I'm more forgiving. Because maybe you should be forgiving. You know, this is
So
enough.
if your child does something wrong, you're gonna forgive them?
Yeah, I'll punish them first. Because I want to save their lives. I want them to behave differently and be more successful. But of course you forgive people. It's like, why hold a grudge? It's like the worst thing you can do for yourself on top of for the other person. I mean, holding grudge, you know, I put it to people, like, you know, is forgiving somebody a bein adam la'atzmo or bein adam la'chavero? Is it a mitzvah you do for yourself or you do for other people? I think it's a mitzvah you do for yourself. I mean, like, carrying around a grudge and not forgiving people is just a great way of carrying around toxic hate the rest of your life. That takes years off your life. It's like, don't do that to yourself. Like, really, don't do that to yourself. Be more forgiving because it makes your life better. You know, like, I like how you're looking at her. You guys are friends.
What?
You guys are friends.
Oh no! Wait, it's
But like but it's like you can only say these sorts of things if you're comfortable enough saying, yeah, sometimes I'm gonna screw up. It's like, that's okay.
So if you're not comfortable with that, you can't learn a lesson.
Yeah, basically.
If you can't accept to make mistakes in this class, you kind of feel like
That's it. In life, not just a class. This in life.
I don't know. What if you feel
In
like you're
life.
always a screw up? Like all you do is screwing up.
Then you're missing the other side of the story, because it's never you're always a screw up.
So you're never all good and you're never all bad.
That's it, man.
You're a medium.
It's a fun struggle.
But like,
It's a fun struggle that you get
the
to
vast
have.
majority of gray area can be grouped into
And no, and yeah, but really no, and yes at the same time.
No.
Right. It takes a certain amount of courage to touch it. Because, like, yeah, who wants to feel bad? I mean, we're designed to not want to feel bad. I mean, fair enough. But it's like, you got to be willing to risk feeling that to feel good. That's the biggest problem in therapy today, is everyone's running to feel better. But feeling better actually makes things worse.
So you shouldn't feel better? Like your therapist shouldn't help you feel better?
I love the eye contact here.
I mean, like,
There's just me.
you seem like a very fun therapist.
I am a very fun therapist. I'm a very fun therapist because it takes the weight. It takes the weight off. It takes the weight off.
But so then, what do you want to do? If you don't want to make you feel, if you're not trying to make yourself feel better, then what's the point of therapy? What are you trying to do in therapy?
Make life more meaningful. You're making your life bigger than the problems you have.
That is very true.
It's so deep for a therapist, though. I feel like my therapist isn't that deep.
Yeah, well, maybe he's not. I don't know. But it's like good metaphor for life is how do you fix a salty soup? You can't get the salt out. You just add water. You make your lives bigger. And when you make your lives bigger, you suffer less. Do yourself a favor and be bigger people. It's as simple as that.
Should I write this
What do you
down?
mean be bigger?
I don't know. I feel like suffering. I don't know if I agree with that.
Wait, it's fine.
I feel like suffering,
Yeah.
just making your world bigger doesn't make it less.
How do you
When you need
make
to fix
your
your
world
suffering,
bigger,
if
though?
you do need to feel better, you gotta work it out. But making your life bigger isn't how you work it out. Working out is taking problem from problem.
And we'll tackle that maybe next week. Because that's a pushback. It's fair enough.
I'm making your world
Am I
bigger.
not allowed to push back?
You're allowed to push back. I think it's fair enough. And we'll tackle it. I can't answer that in like 30 seconds.
I know. I feel
I
like you're the
know.
kind of teacher who likes pushback.
I do like pushback.
I love pushback.
That's just fine.
I don't know how to do it.
You remind me of my teacher.
I didn't want your answer, man. I
His
wasn't
name,
asking
we call him
you.
Ramzak. He's awesome.
Was I asking you, Rena?
Thank you.
That's
What
very
Anywho.
What
So-
is extremely
So I mean, brass tacks, like bringing it back is like, okay, you got to get your license. You got to be willing to test drive Judaism. You got to be willing to be open to the experience within your heart and your body. Does this actually work? Does this function well? And that's a proof too. It's not a proof up here, but it's a proof in your life. So give it a test drive. That's the class. Give it a test
I'm not
drive.
legally allowed to drive yet. Sorry.
Yeah.
Wait, how old
Yeah.
are you?
Me?
Anyway, questions, comments, concerns. How was that? Was that okay? Was that too strong? Was that okay?
That was
I like
Because I actually want to know, like, because
I
like
actually like
it's not often people like pushing like you're terror. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say to somebody, but like I'm really like, was that okay?
But I know I'm
Yeah.
a terror.
Good,
That was good.
good.
No,
Because it's okay.
Terror.
You just work it out is all. That's okay.
I'm trying to
Yeah.
grasp the
You
understanding
dare?
of like how
It's too general.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean the world's more negative? What do you mean?
when I make those
When you
gray
detail.
area decisions,
Yeah.
most of them lean towards
Did your nails dry?
And so it feels like no matter what I make,
Did they
I
dry?
can't make the right decision because 80% of the time
Yeah,
I'm
mine
making
too.
negative
Are they
impact.
good?
Like,
If they're
I mean,
not,
that might
it's
that
your
might be
fault.
more of like a longer like one-on-one conversation. It's like, well, maybe actually you're being too hard on yourself.
I couldn't stop laughing.
If that's your
for an
experience, you
old
might
laugh.
actually be too hard on yourself. I mean, I know you. You're pretty smart. You're a nice person. I am sure you're not making the decisions you think you are. You might actually be making a lot better decision than you think.
I am good.
You know, it goes both ways. Like
I don't understand
you gotta
that,
see
though.
you're a terror, but man, you have to also see you're an angel.
That's because
You gotta see both.
I don't